attending today. We've got audience members from around the world. We've got panelists and speakers from around the world as well, and we're really looking forward to the conversations that we are going to have. Okay, so first of all, this series is the Sadler seminar series, Telling Operatic Stories, Race, Ethics and Authenticity, is supported by the Leeds Arts and Humanities Research Institute and held in partnership with Opera North as part of the DARE collaboration between Opera North and the University of Leeds. I'm Edward Venn from the School of Music at the University of Leeds. I'm co-chairing today's session with Lushen Zhao. We look forward to involving everyone, our wonderful panel who I'll introduce shortly, and also attendees as part of these discussions. And we'd like to give thanks at the outset to the people that have made this possible, not just the participants and the audience, but also Erin Pickles and James Stark at the Leeds Arts and Humanities Research Institute, Linda Watson, Dan Merrick, Jack Craddock and Colin Bradbourne from the School of Music, and Fern Pullen, Becky Smith, Roland Thomas and Dominic Gray at Opera North. So thank you everyone. Now pass over to Lushen.
Oh, hi everyone. Next, I would like to introduce some housekeeping rules in this webinar. So firstly, this event is being live streamed on the School of Music and is being recorded. Also, audience cameras and microphones are off. We strongly encourage participation throughout the webinar by means of chat and questions and answers function, and I will be monitoring chat through the session. And we ask that chat comments remains cordial and constructive throughout. We encourage debate and representation of different views, but hostile or offensive comments will be removed. And the speaker biographies and further information about the events, please have a look about this QR code, and you can scan it, and you will see the further informations and the links to the speaker's biographies. And the final one is some of the content we will discussing today involves sensitive issues. So we please kindly to remind everyone and audience to consider some words in different countries have different meanings. So so they're using, so please show the tolerance if the fantastic mistakes are made. Yeah, so I will pass to the Edward.
Okay, so by way of introduction to today's session, we've got a series of headlines chosen almost at random from the last 18 months. Many more could be included, but we have here Scottish Opera withdrawing from an awards ceremony due to yellow face makeup. We've got Anna Netrebko posting a picture of herself on Instagram with blackface. Angel Blue withdrew from the Verona Opera for just that reason. Russell Thomas, the Royal Opera House's first Black Othello, calling for greater onstage diversity, and criticisms of a new opera based on the lynching of Emmett Till being told primarily from the perspective of a white teacher. At stake here are questions about how audience listen, which audiences are listening, who has the right to tell certain stories, and how organizations facilitate or inhibit authentic creative voices. So this series has been conceived in response to pressing issues such as these in both the opera industry and also within opera studies. Over the course of the next year, academics and voices from the opera and music industry will come together to discuss these operatic stories, discuss who is telling them and who the stories are being told to. Our specific focus are how these stories and those involved in the creation, performance and reception of those stories intersect with issues of race, ethics and authenticity. Given the scale and complexities of the problems we're discussing, we do not pretend to be able to offer easy or quick solutions. And today's webinar is conducted in that spirit. This is an introduction, an preliminary exploration of some of these issues. And to this end, we're delighted to welcome a panel of academics drawn from diverse disciplinary perspectives, along with representations from the opera industry. And so we have Sam Durrant, Maggie Kubanyova, Ariana Phillips-Hutton, Lucien and I from the University of Leeds. We're delighted to welcome Imani Mosley from the University of Florida, Matthew Kofi Waldron, the conductor of Opera North's upcoming Pearl Fishers and co-founder of Your Turn Collective, and Dominic Gray, projects director from Opera North. And as Lucien mentioned, speaker biographies can be found on the events page. But I'd like to draw attention to the image on the screen taken from Opera North's recent production of Rigoletto, with Eric Green in the title role. Femi Elufawaju Jr.'s production affected an intriguing way of presenting the otherness of the title character Rigoletto. Traditionally a hunchback, Femi used race as a means of presenting otherness. And I think one of the things that this image might provoke are questions about how race might be used within and as authentic stories, but it also, this image with the notion of listening, with Eric listening to what's going on around, can act as a metaphor for what we want to achieve within this series. We really want the audience to participate in this. Although your microphones and cameras are off by default, we want you to use the chat function, the question and answer function, and engage with us in these conversations to prompt and provoke, to offer your experiences as an international audience, your thoughts and your perspectives as creators, as performers, as listeners to audiences. We want you to be part of these discussions. At the end of today, we're hoping we will collectively have identified some of the most pressing issues and concerns that we can take forward into future webinars within this series. And as such, you as an audience will be very much part of that. Okay, introduction. Oh, one final thing. Please do feel free to follow us on Twitter, to comment as we go along, either today or as the weeks and months unfold. So we've got a link there. Okay, we're ready to begin. We're ready to chat now. And so our first topic of conversation, I would like to turn to Imani, joining us from Florida. And in particular, Imani, your experience working on the recent opera Stinney, An American Execution. And for people who are unfamiliar with the opera, this is a dramatization of the life of George Stinney Jr., a 14-year-old African-American youth who was found guilty of a crime he didn't commit and became the youngest person to be executed in America. Imani, can you tell us a little bit more about your involvement with this opera and the issues that the opera addresses?
Sure. So I was brought on to be the dramaturg for the opera. So the composer, Francis Pollock, and I, we knew each other. We overlapped at Peabody Conservatory in Baltimore. And we had gotten together for some other compositional projects that touched on sensitive issues. And that conversation led to bringing me on to do Stinney, which she had already workshopped quite a bit at Peabody before it made its sort of main stage premiere at the Prototype Festival in New York. And Frances, who is a white woman, we have a lot of things in common in our own personal backgrounds. We're both from the South, we're both from North Carolina. And she was really concerned about telling this kind of story through opera, especially as a white woman. So, she did a lot of what I would call due diligence, which was starting first by approaching George Stinney's family in South Carolina, and letting them know what she was trying to do work-wise, and really, ingratiating herself as part of their family. She even went to their family reunion, which I was invited to but couldn't attend. But so part of the reason that she asked me to work as the dramaturg on this project was because she knew that I was familiar with the kinds of language that would be necessary in order to make this story more grounded in the place and time that it occurs, to make it sound like an opera that's being done by people who know about the South, who know about the South in the second half of the 20th century, specifically the American South, who knows about very specific, like, tidewater colloquialisms, things that would be said in the Carolinas as opposed to some other place. And so she knew that I had that knowledge and that information, and that I would bring that to the story. But I suppose more importantly, she knew that I was someone that she could trust about how to keep this story honest and grounded, and making sure that she was not doing anything that overstepped what she considered to be boundaries in telling the story about race in the American South in the 1940s. It was very important to her that her team, so not just myself, but the other people that she involved in this project, had that in mind and were constantly working with her as real, true collaborators, to make sure that that was happening. So, when I first got the score and was listening to the rehearsal audio, I was going through it and I was marking up language, left, right, and center, and also, helping ask the really hard questions about what she could say, both musically and textually. Not that my permission means anything in the wider world of things, but saying, I think that you're setting it up in the right way. So that way, it doesn't seem like this is language that is coming out of your mouth that maybe you don't have access to or claim to. And her ability to really put that forward in the process of building out this opera, from the compositional stages all the way to the actual production, was really to be lauded, because that was at the heart of telling the story, because it is a hard story to tell. It's a really difficult story to tell, and it's a story that a lot of people, especially a lot of Americans, don't know. And so she really had that at the front of her mind throughout the entire process, and bringing me on to help with that was testament to her really being concerned about how to tell this story in what she thought was the best way and the appropriate way for the story's sake.
Wonderful, thank you. So you've already brought out so many issues already central to this series, particularly around authenticity, and I think representing those authentic voices. Maggie, if I might bring you in here, there's a kind of ethical dimension as well when we bring these different communities together. Could you talk a bit more about your work and how it feeds into this?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. And thank you, Imani, as well. It really helps me to kind of see how your involvement was informed by some of the things that form part of the kind of framework that I'm working with. So yeah, I'll try to make some of those connections. So I guess so I'm definitely somebody who doesn't really belong to this network in the sense of disciplinary expertise. So I'm from the School of Education. My area of expertise is actually linguistics and language in education. But I guess the reason why I'm here is that I am a principal investigator of an international network funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council. And that network is entitled The Ethics and Aesthetics of Encountering the Other. And what we're really doing, and I think one of the kind of most possibly frustrating conclusions that we are making, is that ethical encounters are in fact ongoing hard work and require that sort of collaboration that you've been talking about, Imani, and that pre-reading that we had for today really kind of illustrated. So there are certainly no answers as to what makes a piece an ethical piece, what makes operatic storytelling ethical. But what I want to highlight particularly is that that work that goes on before the operatic storytelling is offered to the audience, what happens afterwards, and also it's the question around what that operatic storytelling is aimed to achieve, what sort of impact on an audience we're really hoping to make. And I think those questions will inform what goes on in preparation for that storytelling. So I guess the questions around, so within my network, we're drawing on the kind of definitions of the other, and we're kind of drawing on Emmanuel Levinas, which is a white French philosopher who kind of theorizes the other with capital O as somebody who is irreducibly different, unique, and us placing or imposing any sorts of categories, whatever they may be, always reduces the other. And then there's George Yancey, an American a philosopher, Black philosopher, who says that the kind of racial injustice is really in that, you know, while we have been able to kind of accord that sort of uniqueness to the white body, we haven't quite done the same to the Black body. And it's around, you know, how do we not kind of essentialize around sort of categories and phenomenologies perhaps that are not very helpful. And so I think that kind of throws all sorts of questions around what we actually mean by difference, from which positions we are talking about difference, you know, are we, you know, where are we in that kind of dynamic? What sort of power relationships are going on? So those questions remain important, but I think what really struck me about the approach is that willingness of whoever is trying to tell the story, the willingness of that person to really embrace the possibility that you will never know the story of the other, and you will always be in a position of having to listen to diverse perspectives. So I think the kind of result that we see is something that speaks to, or kind of points to, an ethical approach rather than an ethical outcome, because we will never be able to sort of determine that. But I think that, yeah, so that collaborative aspect. And one other thing, Ed, I hope you don't mind, hope I'm not taking too much space, but I would really like to open up a conversation, so not trying to address it, around language. So I was really struck by your, Imani, your kind of approach and how you've been really kind of, invited to form part of the team on the basis of language and authenticity and bringing that perspective. There's lots of really interesting sociolinguistic discussion around how people use language. What does it mean to use language? What are the attitudes of the listeners? And how do you create, kind of use artistic tools to really engage the audiences in new ways of listening? So yeah, I think I'll end there, but there's plenty for me to certainly reflect on.
Thank you, Maggie. I've certainly got some thoughts in response to that, but before I leap in, any responses? Don? You're muted.
I am. I'm sorry about that. Thanks, Imani. That was really helpful and interesting, and Maggie's response to it. Just to pick up on a couple of things, just to kind of reinforce, I guess, what Maggie's response to Imani's thing. specificity, if that's the right way of pronouncing it, is so important in this discussion. We were talking offline earlier, some of us, about some opera in the canon of opera, particularly 19th century opera, being unspecific, being the exotic or the oriental, and just having done with that, which gives us huge challenges in presenting those operas, because they haven't done the homework, they haven't done the deep dive into language. And so it's so helpful what Imani's saying about, and that process of working with Francis, to be specific, to always be specific and concrete about whatever as you say, about tidal flows. You've got to get that right if you're going to take an audience with you. So that's one comment. And then the other thing that made me think about when you were talking so much about language, Maggie, is the possibilities of intervention around, again, I'm talking about the classical canon, I'm afraid, but the possibilities of intervention around things like translation. So if you're not singing the opera in Italian, but you're singing it in English, there's an opportunity there for the translator and the dramaturg to work on that specificity, perhaps. And we see this in spoken theatre, where there's a new production in spoken theatre of Antigone, say, or an Ibsen play, might well have a new translation which is addressing the politics and the subtextual politics within the piece, because of that opportunity. So I think there's a lot in what we're saying here, which I think could be really helpful for change.
Okay, Ariana.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, all of you, for all of those interesting reflections. One thing I was really struck by was this idea, that relationship that exists between Imani, yourself, and Francis, but also how that sort of spreads out into loads of other people who are involved in this. And I was thinking about this in relationship to this idea of relational narratives, an idea Adriana Cavarero talks about, Italian philosopher. And this idea that we need other people to tell us our own stories sometimes, because no one can narrate the story of their own birth, is what she says. And the point there is partially that we require a community to sort of help us construct these things for ourselves. And I think that is potentially productive. I think there's some problems with that approach as well, but I think that might be something interesting to think through. Who's narrating and how are those relationships negotiated? But then the other thing that brought up in me is this idea of recognition. The point is that we don't know George Stinney Jr.'s story, and it's not been sort of integrated into the fabric, certainly of American public life, but even more generally. So maybe one step at some point is to think about how are these stories then made to be recognized, acknowledged as part of the public historical fabric within the US and then beyond.
On that front, Imani, sorry, Matthew, you had your hand up first.
Yeah, I was just going to say there's this conversation about language is really important, and a specificity, and particularly with new work, because if we're saying the old work is a slightly more general, maybe a lot of artists don't have that many problems with rehearsing that repertoire, but with new repertoire, particularly with something like Stinney and the pieces that I've been working on recently, the specificity actually has a knock-on for the artists, because the artists involved, you're telling their stories, and it's really important that, as well as looking for the audience, we're looking to the artists and how we hold them through that process as well, and that we are really specific and that we communicate with them clearly early on as well. It's really, really important.
Wonderful. Thank you. Imani, if I can try and pull some of these thoughts together and add my own gloss. So we've spoken a lot about language with an emphasis, I think, maybe on spoken language and the verbal language there. And I was just wondering, in the case of Stinney, but this word hold for, I think, a whole range of new operas in which the language is based on authentic modes of expression, to what extent does the music support that message of authenticity? Because to take Dom's point about things like Pearlfishers, where the music is entirely inauthentic but connotes exoticism to its Parisian audiences, what was the musical substance of Stinney?
Yeah, so that's a really interesting question, because Francis takes a couple of approaches here that I think head off some problems at the pass. So a large majority of the score is electronic. And what I think that does is it allows for the sound world to not necessarily be rooted in the idea of a pastness that maybe not everyone has access to, which can kind of walk you down the road of possible essentialism to come. So her sound world in that opera is just about, I would term it as just like an overall sonic violence. Not to be too graphic, but George Stinney was accused of raping and murdering 2 young girls. And part of the murder was that they had railroad tent spikes driven into them. And so she uses that kind of mechanical, mechanistic sound to really be a sort of driving musical force throughout the opera. So it's less about a portrayal of personhood and more about a portrayal of acts and violence, because the whole opera is about systemic violence, violence of the state, violence against these 2 young girls and violence against George. And so she really puts a lot of energy into representing that. There are sort of more like examples of music that are supposed to be more representative. So the opening of Act 2 takes place in the Stinney's church in Alcalou, and it's a sermon that's being had. And so there are these sort of pullings in of what sort of Black congregational music has sounded like. And so we do hear that throughout the opera, but again, it's not supposed to be used in a way that says, okay, here are these people, they're Black in the South and they go to church and this is what Black churches in the South sound like. But more about like, this is a place that is real and continues to exist in a lot of ways, because the story is about this small town and this community. And so she uses those kinds of things to represent this general kind of community, but doesn't attach it to characters in such a way where it's like, oh, this person is singing gospel music at this moment, or something like that. And so I think these 2 approaches that she takes really allows, one, for the sort of textual language to speak, but also doesn't bog the story down into this thing where it's like, oh, I'm supposed to think that what I am hearing is representative of South Carolina in the 1940s, because that's not what the story is really about, right? That's just a place and a time. And so I think by taking those kinds of compositional approaches, she can avoid the sort of like musical specificity that can like bog a story down. That's like the flip side of a general kind of like exoticism or Orientalism, as an example. That's the sort of, you know, 180-degree location of what you can do musically, and that's how she gets out of, in my personal opinion, I think that she gets out of that trap by constructing the score in that way.
I was just very struck there at the start when you mentioned how the sound world, in a sense, captures something of the systemic violence and that universalizing gesture. And I was just thinking of all of those other operatic characters stuck within systems that perpetuate violence. So, you know, Wozzeck, Peter Grimes, and so on. And I think that helps also address some of these authentic issues of authenticity that we're talking about, almost mythologicizing the experience. Oh, that was a word I should have thought of before you're saying. So anyway, these stories, I think I would like to just move the conversation on just slightly and turn to Matthew and your experience of another new operatic creation and migrations. Could you tell us a bit more about that?
So yeah, we're currently on tour with Welsh National Opera with this production, and we premiered it earlier this summer. It's 6 narratives, 6 different narratives of migration. It was taken originally, David Pountney had an idea of setting a piece around the anniversary of the Mayflower and having a chorale-based piece, and it rapidly grew. And there are stories of inward migration and colonization. So there's the Cree Nation in Canada, and the colonization of their lands and for oil and gas pipes, and the effect on the community there. There's 18th century Bristol with Pero Jones, who was a house slave in Bristol, and incredibly well educated man, loved by the family, ran the accounts for the family, but was separated from his home, from his family, turned to alcohol. And there's quite a psychological take on what Pero might have been thinking. There's the story of birds migrating and the consequences of climate change on birds. There are 2 standalone stories. There's an English lesson set in 2019 of refugees studying English, which is used as a vehicle to tell the stories of. So if you're learning simple phrases, what is your job? And he said, well, I'm not anything. I was a teacher, which is then a vehicle for us to hear people's stories. This is the Life is a story set in 1960s the UK, with doctors coming from India to work in the NHS, and the problems that they encountered, or the false pretenses that they might have, have been brought over on, or their false advertising, let's say. And is that all of them? I think it might be all of them. But bringing those 6 narratives together is quite a task. It's been a huge project. With we have a community chorus on stage. I think that's one of the first times that's been done on main stage opera, of bringing a community gospel choir in to sing with the Welsh National Opera chorus. There's a birds chorus who are children. We've have the orchestra. It's expanded with lots of percussion, but Jasdeep Singh Digun, who is artist in residence at Opera North, also co-composer. This is a live scene with Will Todd. Yeah, it's been a real journey full of challenges, full of a lot of joy, a lot of tears, and an important project that has it fulfilled every goal? Has it answered all the questions? Has it solved everything? No. But has it started things? Yes. It feels like for the industry, like we're workshopping as we go somehow on how we are meant to do opera like this, how we are meant to reflect today's society, how we are how we can bring people of different disciplines and different genre into our wonderful world of classical music, and how we can invite people in and make our world more vibrant. But it throws up a lot of questions and a lot of challenges. Yeah, but we just have to be open to them, I think.
Wonderful, thank you. I think one of the, as you were talking about the scale and the involvement of lots of people, this really just feel like, whilst the stories are on a global, well, a human scale, but also global, it's also got this community element that you're working with the broader community. And that makes me wonder, how did local audiences respond to this? How has the dialogue between WNO and the community helped shape the reception of migrations?
That's an interesting question. There has been a different audience for sure, because actually, even just when you have a community chorus and bringing their friends, their family, you have a different professional company on stage. They're bringing different people along, and it just does speak to different people. I think the reception is varied, I would say. I actually, critically, it's been pretty well received, and actually very, very well received by the national press. But I think that people find it challenging. You are dealing with sensitive subjects. You are dealing with sensitive language, and stories which ask an audience to also look at themselves and to look at the world in which they live, which is hard. Within 2 hours, can you plumb the depths of every story and all the issues? No. So do you run into the danger of occasionally being glib, perhaps? So is that something you need to watch? So there are some people who have found some stories and some of the narratives more successful than others, but a lot of people have then found the overall architecture of the piece, and that was for me the important thing, particularly as a conductor, was how then I could bring this piece together as one. And Will Todd, who composed the majority of the music, did an excellent job of that. But how we could then musically really see this as one piece, so people could go away and say, yes, I've had a great theatrical experience as well. I haven't been sat through a lecture, I haven't sat through a seminar on this. I've gone and I had a real theatrical experience, and I've enjoyed some bits. I've been challenged by other bits. I didn't enjoy other bits. Well, every opera, I might suggest, has those ingredients, or the potential to. And it's not our job as artists either to tell people what they should like or dislike about a piece, how they should react to the piece. My job in the end is to give a good representation, or an honest representation of what I think the piece is and the score is, with the people with whom I'm making the piece. But we've, it's been very well received. I think there is a different audience. In fact, one of the members of the gospel choir, her father was in the other day, and he was raving about the piece, and he hadn't been to see that much opera before, but he loved it, and he said, I'm going to come back. And then I spoke to a more, let's say, traditional audience member the next day on the phone, traditional operatic audience member who just said, well, I didn't really get on with it that well. I thought you did a great job and I thought you brought it together, but it just didn't work for me. So, which is fine, you know, and I think, I mean, Dominic might have something to say, but I think that in opera, we focused a lot on finding a new audience. And I'm not sure whether that is exactly the right approach, actually. I wonder whether we should be more concerned with finding new audiences. You know, is the audience for migrations going to be the same as the audience for Alcina? Probably not. Might there be some crossovers? Might somebody who's been to migrations for the first time go to Alcina? Yes. Might they go and see Yeoman of the Guard? Possibly not. So how do we engage new audiences? And this migrations has been a great way of doing that, actually, because you're telling so many different stories and you're making people think, oh, well, I didn't expect opera to be that. Over the years, a lot of people have come to see me, friends, family, to see me conduct operas who haven't ordinarily gone to opera. And in fact, actually, even a Pearlfishers years ago, and said to me, oh, I really enjoyed it. I really enjoyed it, but I'd always thought it wasn't for me. And I thought, wow. I mean, some of these people are in their 60s, 70s, and you think, what have we done wrong as members of this industry, as musicians, as a society, that we've told people that this isn't for them, and they've spent 60 years not engaging with something that could have enriched their lives. So anything that we can do, and migrations is one of those projects, anything we can do to enrich people's lives is a great thing.
Thank you very much. Maggie.
Thanks. So Matthew, I'm looking forward to seeing that in Birmingham. I've booked tickets for migration. So yeah, that would be an interesting experience. I guess I just wanted to it is a difficult topic in general, and I guess when it comes to storytelling and deciding on, you know, whose stories are told and who tells them. So I think that question lingers for us all at all times. So within Ether, within the network, we had this very difficult conversation where there were questions around, you know, how do we use other people's stories? What do we even think about, you know, what do we think we're doing when we're asking people to tell stories and then we kind of transform those stories into operatic storytelling or whatever other storytelling? So we had examples. So Jonathan Dowd, for example, wrote a blog for us when he was talking to immigrants and kind of about their experience, and a very honest account about the challenges of what this involves. And so, and we then had an educator who talked about ESOL educator. So that's English for speakers of other languages, and that's usually immigrants or adults attending classes in order to satisfy certain criteria for immigration purposes for our international audiences. So, and there are some really difficult questions about, you know, how we use our pedagogic or artistic practice ethically, and that may involve asking ourselves questions around, do we need to do some kind of additional work? So like you've been talking about, Matthew, around, you know, how you brought different communities together, and Imani, how Francis, you know, talked to various people. And I guess this is probably a theme that I would like to explore further. You know, who do we invite to the table, and what do we do when those people are around the table? Who gets to say what? Who gets the last word? You know, how are decisions made on the basis of the kind of, shared storytelling. So yeah, I'm just kind of opening up questions, really. I don't have the answers, but just wanted to allude to the kind of fact that we had a very difficult conversation around storytelling. So I really look forward to seeing the outcome of your hard work, Matthew. Thanks.
Thank you. I think, Matthew, you had your hand up.
Yeah, I mean, just to respond to Maggie, thanks for that, because it's a hugely important topic. And I'm not sure that I have the answers either. I spoke to Jonathan Dove as well earlier this year, I think in February, about this very thing. And he was telling me his experiences talking to immigrants and refugees, and whose story was it to tell. And this was certainly something that was obviously the writers of Migrations had talked long and hard about, and Sarah, who wrote the English lesson, had worked very closely and still does with the refugee community in Cardiff. But I would be lying if I said that in the rehearsals that there weren't still those issues for us. How do we, everybody in the room needed to know how did we get to this point? So there's just something in rehearsal, isn't there, I think, as well, when we're putting on these new pieces. They might just take a little bit longer, because we actually have to communicate to everybody how we've got to a certain point, and whose story this is, and have they given permission, and how they've given permission, so that we can all do our job, because there are so many questions to be answered with that. It comes down, you even have the question of who has the right to compose something, who has the right to pen something, conduct something, direct something, design something, and it's tricky. It's certainly tricky. Once the piece exists, though, my job is then to try and bring that piece to life musically in the most honest, sincere way that I can. And actually, the English lesson, the project scene, I think was well handled, and is well handled in the sense that it's treated as an abstract, so that this could be anybody, this could be any of us. And I think that was really important, because we're not going to have somebody who is a Syrian opera singer necessarily, or someone from South Sudan singing that role of a South Sudanese refugee. So we need to find a way of representing that honestly, but in a way that doesn't offend, but in a way that also asks questions of an audience as well, I think. Or that's one approach. So it's really hard, and I don't have all the answers for sure.
Thank you, Matthew. Imani, I think your hand was next, and then Sam and Dom.
Yeah, I just wanted to say really quickly, I think in response to what Maggie brought up, and also what you're talking about, Matthew, just sort of the overall process of doing operas like this, is that I think we seem to be hitting upon a theme around invitation and process that doesn't necessarily mean that the results will lead to a kind of understood authenticity, if such a thing actually ever really exists. But for the first time, really, in the history of this genre, are we seeing just the idea of invitation as being a part of the compositional process, and that alone in and of itself is something that is worth discussing, regardless of what the results might be. And I bring this up because I know we're going to be talking about canonical things too. And so, you know, as just kind of a juxtaposition to works that have already been written and have become part of canonical operatic repertoire, what that aspect of the compositional process looks like and how that affects these larger conversations that we're having. Because of course, there's all the other stuff that comes afterwards, who's involved, what the work is, how it's performed, who it's told to, who it's told by, all of that kind of stuff, right? But just the fact that at this very sort of like nucleus type stage, that composers and librettists and dramaturgs are even thinking about this sort of very large scale idea of invitation is something that I think fundamentally reshapes the way that we think about what opera is as a genre and what it does, and allows these kinds of conversations. And maybe this is a way to have a conversation about already existing canonical works.
Thank you very much. I'm aware we've got lots of hands. I'm sure we'll pick up on many of those points as well. But Sam, over to.
I had a question for Matthew that really reflects also on Imani's work. Fascinating to hear everybody's discussions, and I have almost zero expertise, so I'm feeling very silly in lots of ways. But from a literary perspective, which is where I come from, we obviously make the distinction between form and content. And the politics of representation tends to be often at the level of content. Imani, when you started talking about the soundscape and what the opera sounded like, that seemed to me an important way of thinking about authenticity, that it gets sidelined by some of the cruder ways, you know, the headlines that you brought up at the beginning, Ed, about representation in very much crude ways. Okay, this is a story about this, and therefore it's a black story or whatever it is. And I didn't really get a sense, Matthew, of what happens to your opera musically when you invite people in from outside of a classical Western tradition. So I wondered if you could say more about, because to invite people in, but to remain a host who's sort of in charge is a problem. And I just wondered what morphed, what changed in your practice to make it not such a kind of host-guest relation, but something where the opera itself is kind of morphing, and what we mean by opera and what we mean by classical music kind of might change.
Yeah, that's a really great question. And it's hard, isn't it? Because once you've written a piece, often it's a fixed thing. It's like it's as a structure. But there were things. So I was actually going to say to Imani, the process, I think composition, I don't want to speak for Will, but I think the compositional process was different. And for example, Marion Newman, who is a First Nation opera singer, was playing the character Dawn, or is playing the character Dawn, Cree Nation woman. And Will has composed a folk song for her to sing. And they had discussions beforehand. So he reached out to, how do you reach this? And said, how can I help? How can I write this? And she said, please, whatever you do, don't write it with flutes and drums. Please just don't, because she's done all that stuff, And she said, don't try to write something that is Cree. Don't try to write something that is First Nation. Write me a folk song. Write the lyrics. And he did that. And it was very simple and very beautiful. But then the process is slightly different when you come to rehearse, because she sang it in the first rehearsal incredibly beautifully. But I think we all felt that there was something lacking, something missing, some element missing. And so the conversation then is between me and as conductor and Marion as an artist, and saying, and Marion as an artist, not just an artist, but Marion as an artist of First Nation background. And I don't have that background. I don't know how it's not my place to say, you must sing it like this, which is different, right? Because conductors say, you must sing it like this. But in this case, it was a sense of saying, is this an element where you think we could bring something that feels Cree. I'm not asking you to sing it in a Cree style, but it's just something which would give it more authenticity for you, and but wouldn't be appropriation. And so she was able to go away and think, and she was also able to talk to some of her friends from the Cree Nation, and something that came back was the heartbeat. So we could incorporate this heartbeat rhythm, which then changed the folk song entirely. And it was one thing, but we didn't need to pastiche, add in drums. And for Marion as well, then for an artist to be given that freedom was a really new thing. And particularly as someone, for her, it was an incredibly important narrative, because it's the story that she is living and has lived all her life. In the Indian section, This Is a Life, I'm sure Will won't mind me saying, back in 2019, I was invited to conduct this show, and we were meant to do it in 2020, but something else happened in 2020, I think we can all remember, and it was cancelled. But a couple of days after I was invited to conduct it, they was having a sing through of the piece in Cardiff, and I went along, and there was lots that I said to Will, okay, let's restructure this. I think you should cut this, get rid of this. But I said to him, you know, my biggest challenge is this is the live scene. I can't tell you why, but it just doesn't sit right with me. And it just felt a little pastiche. And when Will went away to look at it, he realized it was, because it was a westernized view of what potentially a Bollywood scene might sound like with sitar, and that just wasn't going to ring true. Now, it was never going to be a scene that was classical Indian music, because it was always designed by the librettist as well to be a hybrid scene. But Will then went away and was in touch with Jasdeep Singh Dignan and asked Jasdeep to come on board. And so then Jasdeep could co-write that scene with him. So Jasdeep could write in rags and say, no, we'll write in this rag. And then we can make a scene from that. Was it a perfect scene? How do we go about creating these scenes? I don't know. Could it have been done better initially? Probably. Does a hybrid always work? It works for some people, not for others. But again, it goes back to, I think, what Maggie was saying earlier on, being very clear about what it is you want to say to your audience, and what it is you're trying to achieve. And if the librettist is trying to achieve a certain thing, you want to achieve that with them. And I think Will and Jasdeep did that. So there have been, definitely, we're inviting people in. It is different as well, because jazz reads music brilliantly, but not all sitarists do, and tabla players do. We actually, even in the rehearsal period, had a workshop with Jazz. So Jazz came and spent the whole day with us, and we went through the scene, and we went, okay, we need to, Jazz wanted to add some improvisation here and and change the structure of the scene, and that was great. And we're inviting Jazz in to do that. But also, you are right, Sam, my job then is still the overall architecture of the piece. So you come to some sort of understanding, there's a compromise, there's saying, well, yeah, we could have that amount of improvisation, but any longer we suddenly lose the dramatic impetus of the scene. Or so there's a negotiation, and I suppose, and a compromise. And then there are just logistical things, aren't there? If you're in a 3-hour rehearsal with an orchestra and you say, I need to go from letter N, this is a thing where you say, well, we're going from letter N, and everybody needs to know where letter N is. But so you have to have found a way beforehand. A lot of it's about communication with people beforehand, so that you can devise structures and systems so that you can rehearse effectively in the rehearsal system that we have in opera, and that's important. So the rehearsals were different in that we had workshops in the rehearsal. But by the time we got to the business end in terms of orchestral reads, Sitzprobe, stage and orchestra, when I get to the stage and orchestra, there isn't really the time, you know, because every minute counts for us conductors at that point. But it has been a really interesting process, and I don't think it hasn't solved anything, it hasn't everything, it hasn't answered all the questions. But I really think for some of the artists, for Marion, for example, it was actually quite liberating to be included. And actually, that's another word, isn't it? Inclusion, because diversity is one thing, the inclusion is the other, and a lot of that is down to communication. I think pre-process. I think
that touches on actually one of the questions that Neve's posed in the question and answers, which we'll come to shortly. But Matthew, I hate to stop you there. I'm just conscious of time. So Dom, you've had your hand up for a while. So if you can respond, and then
I can leave it if you. I mean, I'll just be very, very brief because I know you want to move on. But what Matthew was saying at the end there chimes a lot for me with what Maggie was saying in response to Imani's first provocation, which is we've got to, as a sector, we've got to give the time for these conversations to happen way before we even decide whether we're going to do this show or not. We can't do it on the run. It's got to be embedded in what we're doing all of the time. So for us, you know, we've got Jazz Deep as artist in residence with us for a year. He's already doing his opera. We'll get that out of the way. In a way, the thing that we want to be doing with him is learning about process, learning about how we collaborate ongoing, which the public, well, hopefully the public would see, but I think it comes back to what Imani was saying. Invitation is part of the process. This is such an important sentence, I think. And it is, you know, it's challenging to invite in at the moment or before the moment of conception. So we're going to start this entirely with you, not bring you in as an advisor later on. This is really great. I think I'm very stimulated by this.
Yeah. And on this note, thank you. I mean, just picking up on Neve's question here around how these questions around audience and invitation and the space in which they might belong. So she asks, how much does this actually involve shifting away from seeing opera as a genre with rules and templates to opera as a culture and a community that needs to adapt? So, you know, this might well start to lead us towards traditional operas, which we've also got some questions about as well. But where Don, from your experience within Opera North, or perhaps here's Matthew, how do we reconcile the emerging culture around new work alongside traditional cultures with its rules and expectations? Is there an overlap, or is this a large-scale encounter of different operatic cultures taking place under one roof?
If I go first, then I would be interested in what other people say, but I think there's got to be a dialectic. There's got to be a dialogue between the historical, if you like, the inherited canon and the creation of new work and the new ways of creating new work, and that dialogue has got to influence both ways of working, so that you come up with new ways appropriate to the project that you're trying to do. But I think what Maggie was saying earlier about, you know, deciding who you're making the work for, that should be informing the process you go through to make the work. And Matthew touched on a lot of that with the audiences, and, you know, the Yeomen of the Guard audience not being the same as Alcina or Migrations. So I think it's that, you know, a mature opera sector would have ongoing discussion between those two ways of working, I think, which would be mutually beneficial.
We got a question in the another question around well, a two-part question, but the first one sort of the famous works such as Madama Butterfly or Hamilton with issues around race. But I think Madama Butterfly is a great example of one of the more problematic works within the canon. And so there are questions of, how might we use perhaps this dialogue Dom's talking about, or other approaches to inform stagings of such works, or even can we stage such works in these days? So this might be a question around decolonization or so on. So Ariana, maybe I can bring you in at this point to comment on the canon.
Oh, excellent. There's so many interesting work being done in this area, in this question of if or indeed how we might stage these works, which are not only part of the canon. They don't just end up in the canon sort of willy-nilly, right? They're in the canon in part because people have fallen in love with them, and they have beautiful moments. And I'm sort of with Edward Said that if you think something is of an aesthetic value, you can't simply call it racist and end there. You can't just hide things off there. You have to actually choose to do something with it, which actually gets us onto this question of what decolonization is, what it might look or sound like in relationship to opera. And I'm not going to offer any final answers here. Really, just hoping to open up some questions. And maybe to start with, I think one of the best things to do is to, as I said, think about, well, what does decolonization look like, sound like? What would it mean to really come to grips with what is Eurocentric in our operatic canon, which is probably most things in when we're talking about these historical works. But then how might we rebalance the way that they engage with non-European perspectives, non-European forms of knowledge, non-European musics, if indeed that is the case, and put those on an equal footing with the European knowledges that they contain. And there's all sorts of really fascinating points that I think come out of this, but one of the things that really stands out to me, and I think this is both a practical and a philosophical problem, is that this is not easy, this is not quick, and it's certainly not free. It's not even cheap, right? This entails a wholesale transformation of ideology and of artistic practice in some respects, and in artistic materials. You may think that, well, if we're going to restage Madame Butterfly, well, that means that you might need to recreate sets. You might need to get rid of expensive costumes. If you're going to, say, set it in a totally new kind of setting, you might be making alterations to music that may seem, entirely outside the pale. But you might be wanting to consider those sorts of things, which would then require musicians to learn new bits of music, or conductors to make different decisions about how they're going to approach the structure of a work. So my point here about decolonization, or my invitation to other people's comments really is simply to say that this is hard work, and we should treat it as such, which is not to say that we shouldn't do it. Of course, I don't want to create a mountain that's too difficult to climb, but rather to say that it's out there, and we have a wonderful, challenging opportunity to really make that wholesale transformation.
That's fantastic, thank you. I'm sure many of the other panelists will have some comments, but I wonder if we could also throw in at this point Lee's question around the use of language and vernacular language as well. I'm very struck by what Ariana's saying about things not being cheap or easy, and Lee's comment about language or adopting certain vernacular traditions. So I'm thinking about the Royal Opera House's recent Madame Butterfly, in which there was a lot of a consultant was brought in to advise on authentic gestural language for the cast, but not necessarily cast from the East Asian community. And so there are these questions all bound up with what you're saying around the sorts of expense, or the expenses involved in training, the sort of pipeline of singers coming through. And these things come together. So Lee's question, Ariana's comments, I'm sure Dom from the Opera North will have thoughts on this as well. But some incredibly complex issues to unpick here, and we have time to start picking at those threads. So any thoughts at this moment?
I think you invited me, Ed, did you? Because you're muted, but yeah, you did. Okay. Yeah, so I guess just one point on that. So yeah, this is probably for another long conversation. But I guess that idea, yeah, I absolutely agree, Ariana, it is expensive. It is expensive to want to do things differently. And that goes back to Dominic's point around how that collaboration must start way before that work is kind of, worked on it or even conceived. So that's absolutely true. And I guess that is why it's so important to have the kind of collaborations and partnerships in place already. So, last night we were at the event, the 15th anniversary of the DARE partnership. And I think that's the kind of partnership, and of course, similar to this sort of partnerships where you really are working very actively with people across the disciplines already. So when it comes to language, for instance, what comes to mind is that, working with sociolinguists, somebody who kind of has a deeper understanding of linguistic practices of particular communities because of the kind of ethnographic work that they have done in those communities or any kind of historical analysis. I guess those would be very productive partnerships, but cultivating them as an ongoing process. I think that's really important. And just kind of, also one very specific or maybe I'll just end here because I think it kind of invites others to consider what a kind of partnership might look like that will facilitate the sort of decolonizing that Ariana was talking about.
Fantastic, thank you. I think Imani, you were next.
Yeah, just like 2 points. One about translation. I just want to say there's a lot of really good scholarship that's happening right now around issues of opera and translation. Everything from what happens when you make choices about what you put in your super titles to language and accessibility. What happens when you create a performance that allows for those who are deaf or hard of hearing, those who are blind, how are nuances of those sets of vernaculars treated and introduced when trying to present operas both old and new to other audiences. So and of course, specific cultural, historical things that have been kind of overlooked when we talk about the history of opera and translation. So there's a lot of good stuff that's happening right now, scholarship-wise, about what that looks like. So I just wanted to say that. But I'm going to say something slightly, just maybe a little bit controversial, if I may. I firmly personally believe that decolonization of opera as a genre is not possible. I say this as a Black and Indigenous scholar who spends a lot of time thinking about what decolonization means, not as an academic concept, but as a very lived, real experience in my life and the life of my family and my friends. And I say this not to say that, when I say I don't think that opera can be decolonized, not to say that what I mean by that is that we can try at it and we'll be unsuccessful, but rather that opera is always going to be a colonial project. Even as we go forward and we make new ones, it's still a part of that history. And I don't know honestly that it helps us about thinking about what we need to do with opera, both new opera and opera that's in the canon, through a necessarily decolonial lens, or even a post-colonial lens. So this is not to say that we don't want to confront these issues and try to figure out how we can create a space where people don't feel that they, as audience members, are not welcome, where we're putting on operas where people feel conflicted about what's being represented. We should absolutely do those things. And to Ariana's point, it is incredibly costly. And I would imagine that that is a large part of the reason why a lot of these changes Thank you. Yes, I agree, Kat. Sorry, I have some meowing going on behind me about whether or not those things get done. But the language of decolonization implies like certain end goals and very specific results that opera as a genre is not a part of. And will not contribute to. So I wonder if there is a way in which we can move or refashion that language to say all of the things that we have been saying, which I think, I absolutely agree with as an opera scholar and a practitioner. Those are the things that we should be doing. But understanding that it's okay, actually, that opera came from a very specific Eurocentric model. Like, that's okay. I'm okay with that. Like, that doesn't upset me at my core, because that's true, right? And that it allows us to think really deeply about how that has manifested over the past 400 years, right? And how we approach steps to address the things that we now recognize to be issues and problems, and locate those problems and possible solutions within that model, but that it's going to belong to that always. The only way that it would not is if it became something entirely different, which is not which is not going to be the case, right? So that frees me, at least, from kind of getting in a rut around conversations about works like Butterfly. Because I'm not looking to excise it from that history. I don't know that it's possible. And so then the question is, okay, well, if we can't do that, right? What does the future of a work like this look like? And how can we move forward with that work? What can we do? Do we leave it as is? Do the changes that we make, are they these sort of invitation based things, or is it something else? Does it exist somewhere else? But it's Butterfly, and that's not gonna change, and I'm not asking it to change because I can't, right? I can't do that. So I don't know if that helps to any of the bits of questions that I'm seeing in the Q&A, but that this may be a way that is liberating for us when talking about how we address these really intense, large scale issues, is to free ourselves up from the stress of doing decolonizing work.
Thank you very much. I am aware of time and aware of hands, and I'm so relieved we have many more seminars in this series where we can continue to dive into these questions, because we've unearthed a great deal. But if we've got time for quick responses from, in order, Dom, Ariana, Sam, and then Matthew and his cat, we will be, and that should bring us to the end. So Dom.
Yeah, yes, I'm unmuted. So very quickly, on Lee's question about language, which I think came up in my first comments. I think it's a really good question. I think he's phrased it really well about, might it take us into more risky territory by relocating something using language. I'm not suggesting that. What I'm saying is that opera, and this might take me to Imani's point actually, opera is a composite art form. It's got words, it's got performance, it's got music, it's got image, and it brings those together to tell a story. So my point simply is that language and words are one of our tools on this journey. I don't know at this moment how we deploy that tool. I think what Imani was just saying about surtitles, about accessibility, that's all really part of it as well. So I don't know the answer, but I think we could focus on the music only or on the casting and forget that we've got language there as a tool as well. And then my other thing, because it was a very good intervention from Imani, but I'm just gonna defend opera for a moment and say simply that opera, as we all know, simply means work. It's a work that brings together a variety of art forms to tell a story. So I'm not prepared to say it can't be decolonized. I think it can, because I may be convinced as we go on through the series, but it feels to me, the ancient opera was invented to reinvent what the ancient Greeks had done with Greek tragedy. That was the vision of it. And if you look at those Greek tragedies, the early Greek tragedies, they're simply a place or a space where a society comes together to talk to itself and to work out its problems and the divisions within its society through performance. And I think opera can be that.
Wonderful, thank you, Dom. Sam, you were next.
I suppose my position is slightly between Dominic's and Imani's here. I think Imani, I absolutely loved that intervention, because I think I probably do agree with you when we think about opera as a European institution, that it can't become something completely different. So it seems to me, there's a phrase Adorno has called hating tradition properly, which is quite a useful phrase. And it suggests to me that if we go back to that question of authenticity, that authenticity might be how we hate a tradition properly, that it might be how we disrupt the tradition that's come before in such a way that it rings true, to use a phrase that Matthew was using a lot, which was really, so it's actually a kind of, it's a nebulous idea of authenticity, but authenticity ultimately has a sort of a political resonance that's also aesthetic at the same time, because it's a tradition in dialogue with itself, but also in dialogue with what it's not.
Thank you, yeah. Matthew.
Firstly, apologies for my cat, very hungry cats. Yeah, this is going to obviously be a much longer conversation. I take points from everybody actually, and it is a European construct, and even the rules and regulations that we have in opera companies and rehearsals, the way we put something on, which is learnt, and you get used to it, but it's exclusive. But it works for putting on opera in big houses, and that's why I think opera companies are struggling with new work at times, and classical music companies are, because we're used to putting on Barber of Seville in 6 weeks, and we know how to do that, and we don't really know how to do the rest of it. Hence this conversation. But it is tricky. How can you decolonize the Pearl-Fishers, for example? If you're singing about Brahma, but it sounds like the French Marseillaise, it is a French man. I know, Dom, we're looking at this together, but and I think it will be concert stagings are quite good, I think, because you can be so much more abstract about things. But there are knock-on for casting, and I do think that we have to be very careful that we don't go down too narrow a route. Because we may end up harming ourselves more than helping ourselves. And I would just say that a lot of singers, and nobody really wants to be cast on the basis of the color of their skin, right, or for who they are. So it's really, really important that we find ways for everybody to sing everything, even though groups have been historically underrepresented. I think it was I can't remember his name, who just sang Othello at the Opera House, but he was saying, the big thing is that I am the first Black man to sing Othello. That how can that be? And that's the issue, or an issue. But in whatever we do, we just need to make sure that we make sure that the work we're doing is good and better, and we're not narrowing what we do, and that we should also celebrate opera for it's a powerful art form. It has its problems and challenges, but I've spent many years loving it and still will. So that's just me done.
Wonderful, thank you. And the last word goes to Ariana.
I'll keep this very brief. Thank you, Imani. That was very, very great an intervention, and a really good reminder that we need to be careful about what we're asking music to do, or indeed we're asking musicians or artists to do. And our job is not really to change the world in those kinds of fundamental ways. And decolonization is legitimately about changing the structures of the world. So to have an appropriate humility, but also the courage and conviction to do what is possible through music, I think would be maybe an appropriate theme for another seminar.
Wonderful, thank you. And that leads me on to the final couple of bits of housekeeping today. So first of all, this is just the opening gambit in a much longer conversation. And so coming up, an in-person event for those in the Leeds area on the 21st of October at 5:30 p.m. we will be discussing Opera North's Orpheus. Jasdeep, we've mentioned a few times, Jasdeep Singh Degan's reimagining with Lawrence Cummings of Monteverdi's Orfeo. And so it will be a wonderful opportunity to chat to some of the creative team behind this work and really explore the issues that have emerged through the creation of a genuine meeting of cultures. But at the same time, we are going to be picking up the threads of these conversations. We've opened so many avenues for future discussion. And as you can see on the screen, we have 4 further webinars this semester. And we very much hope you will be involved. And so finally, please do keep in touch. We've got QR codes here and links in the chat to the events listings. Please do follow us and stay in touch on Twitter. But above all, help us set the agenda for this conversation over the coming weeks and months. So tell us your thoughts. We've, if you can spare a few minutes to fill in a form that we've prepared, we've got a link in a chat, and we've got the QR code here. We would love to pick this up. And Mark, you've just asked your question. We haven't got time to deal with that today, but we will definitely pick this up in future events. All that remains for me today is to thank everyone, all of our panel, for their contributions today. It's been a wonderful, enriching conversation to have. There's so many thoughts buzzing around my head as to how we might proceed, and I look forward to continuing these conversations through a variety of format over the coming weeks and months. So everyone, thank you all so much, and we will see you soon. And thank you to all of the audience as well. Thank you now.